The mistaken seat. The afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the tarmac as a luxurious private jet glistened beneath the sky, its sleek, polished surface reflecting the power and prestige it carried. It was the kind of aircraft reserved for the elite, those whose names never appeared on booking lists, whose presence was known more through whispers than announcements. The interior of the plane was designed not merely for comfort but to impress. Plush cream leather seats trimmed with gold, softly glowing lights embedded into the ceiling, and personalized screens displaying warm welcomes to its most prestigious travelers. Quiet classical music flowed through the cabin like a gentle breeze. Every detail spoke of wealth, exclusivity, and high standards. Passengers boarded with the ease of people accustomed to first-class treatment. Their designer luggage was wheeled behind them by assistants or the staff waiting at the entrance. Some wore custom-tailored suits, others flaunted expensive jewelry that caught the cabin light. All moved with the kind of confidence bred from entitlement. Among them walked a woman who did not quite match the expectations of many in that space. Naomi Williams entered the cabin with a quiet grace, her steps measured, her presence commanding not by force, but by an unspoken sense of purpose. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a soft white blouse, with slacks cut perfectly to her frame and shoes that shined, not with glamour, but with dignity. Her hair was neatly braided and pulled back in a low bun. She didn't flash diamonds or designer logos. She didn't need to dot as Naomi stepped inside. Her eyes took a slow, sweeping glance across the cabin. She noticed the layout, the seat numbers, the placement of the windows. She walked toward the front section without hesitation, her leather bag tucked under her arm, her phone set to silent. But before she could fully settle into her designated seat, she was met by a smile more polished than sincere and a voice laced with authority and assumption. Lauren, the lead flight attendant in her early 40s, stood near the entryway, her posture stiff, her uniform crisp, and her tone already shifting from hospitality to scrutiny. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lauren sighed, approaching Naomi with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "May I help you find your seat?" Naomi looked up, her expression calm and kind. "Thank you," she said, "but I found it." Lauren's smile faltered ever so slightly. Her eyes darted to the seat number Naomi had chosen, then back to Naomi herself, then once again to the passenger manifest in her hand. "I think there might be a mistake," she said, with the condescension barely hidden behind her composed voice. "This section is reserved for our premier guests, the elite cabin." "I'm aware," Naomi replied, her tone still gentle, but not yielding. "This is my seat," Lauren stiffened. Something about Naomi, the quiet confidence, the lack of apology made her uncomfortable. It wasn't just the seat. It was Naomi's entire presence which contradicted Lauren's idea of what a person in this cabin should look like. There were no pearls, no name brand screaming from her outfit, no assistant following her with luggage. Lauren folded her arms subtly across her chest. The passenger list clutched between her fingers like a shield. "I think you might be mistaken," she said a little more firmly now, the smile slipping further. "We do have strict policies about who's seated where, and unfortunately this isn't your section." Passengers nearby began to turn their heads. Among them sat Mr. and Mrs. Raymond, a retired couple who had flown this route multiple times and were used to receiving special treatment. Mrs. Raymond clutched her knitting bag while Mr. Raymond scanned the situation over the top of his newspaper. A young socialite wearing oversized sunglasses lowered them to see more clearly. A businessman in a blue suit raised an eyebrow. The energy in the cabin shifted. Naomi remained seated, her back straight, her hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't fidget, she didn't raise her voice. She simply looked up at Lauren, meeting her eyes directly. "I suggest you check the manifest," Naomi said calmly. "You'll see my name there." Lauren chuckled under her breath, a short and unkind sound. "I don't need to," she replied coldly. "I know who belongs here." Something about that sentence struck the cabin like a crack of thunder. A few passengers blinked, some shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned in closer, intrigued by the escalating tension. Naomi's face didn't change. Her serenity was unnerving, almost frustrating to someone like Lauren, who was used to passengers groveling or apologizing when confronted. But Naomi didn't grovel. She didn't apologize. She just waited. Lauren's voice took on a sharper edge. "If you won't move," she said louder this time, so the surrounding passengers could hear, "I will have to call security. This is your last warning." The businessman across the aisle leaned forward. His suit jacket creased as he rested his elbows on his knees. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Lauren didn't turn to him. Her eyes remained locked on Naomi. "No problem, sir. We're just sorting out a misunderstanding." Naomi's calm didn't budge. "There is no misunderstanding," she said. "But I won't be bullied." Lauren's face flushed, her lips tightened. It wasn't just the disobedience. It was the dignity with which Naomi held herself. A part of Lauren wanted her to make a scene, scream, protest, or argue so she could justify calling security. But Naomi gave her none of that. Instead, she gave her grace. "Ma'am," Lauren said with forced restraint, "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane or I will call for removal." Naomi lifted her chin slightly, her voice as soft as ever. "Call who you need to," she said. "I'm not moving." The silence that followed was thick. Mr. Raymond put down his paper. Mrs. Raymond dropped a stitch in her knitting. The socialite leaned so far forward her sunglasses nearly fell off. The businessman let out a low, disapproving hum. Lauren stood frozen for a second, caught between authority and the rising doubt forming in her gut. She turned toward the younger flight attendant, Grace, standing awkwardly near the galley. "Grace," Lauren said sharply, "escort her to the back, now." Grace hesitated. She looked from Naomi to Lauren, then to the passenger list. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the clipboard. She scanned it quickly and paused. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but Lauren saw it and cut her off. "I said now." Grace lowered her eyes and stepped forward, still visibly unsure. Naomi didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat. "You might want to think very carefully about what you're doing," Naomi said softly, addressing Grace but keeping her eyes on Lauren. "This will not end the way you expect." Lauren's jaw tightened. "Stop threatening my crew." "I'm not threatening," Naomi said, still calm. "I'm promising that every action has consequences." That was when Naomi slowly picked up her phone from the seat beside her. She typed something quickly, then placed the phone face down on the armrest. The simplicity of the action sent an unexpected ripple through the cabin. Even Lauren's posture shifted slightly. "You've made a mistake," Naomi said quietly. "A serious one." Passengers whispered to each other now, their voices hushed but intense. Someone at the back of the cabin took out their phone discreetly. Others just stared. No one knew exactly who Naomi was, but they were beginning to suspect. She was not someone you wanted to mistreat. Lauren folded her arms and stood straighter, trying to recover her control. But the doubt in her eyes was growing. And the longer Naomi stayed calm, the more Lauren's confidence unraveled. The pilot hadn't yet emerged from the cockpit. Grace stood still, holding the passenger manifest like a weight she couldn't carry. The cabin, though luxurious and still, felt like a courtroom now, and everyone waited for the next moment, the tipping point. The revealed. Naomi crossed her legs slowly and leaned back. She glanced out the window, as though she weren't at the center of a storm, and whispered something to herself. No one heard the words, but they echoed in Lauren's mind louder than anything spoken. "You judged me, and now everything changes." The slap heard around the cabin, the quiet hum of the engines was the only sound as Naomi sat still, her hands resting on her lap, her expression unchanged. There was no tension in her shoulders, no fear in her eyes, just a deep, centered calm that made every second of silence around her more powerful than any argument could. The other passengers didn't know what to do. Some tried to look away, but their ears stayed tuned to every word. Others stared openly, their interest now overtaken by a strange sense of unease. Lauren stood rooted near Naomi's seat, her arms still folded across her chest, but the confidence in her posture was slipping. The presence of the younger flight attendant, Grace, still lingering awkwardly nearby, only made the moment heavier. Lauren had expected Naomi to fold, to give in, to move quietly to the back of the plane like someone used to being corrected and dismissed. But Naomi had done none of that. She had remained still, calm, unwavering. Her presence was like a mirror reflecting back everything Lauren had hoped to hide: her bias, her assumptions, her misuse of authority. And Lauren, though she'd never admit it, was feeling exposed. Still, she wasn't ready to let go of her pride, her position, or her control. "You think this is about you proving something," Lauren snapped, her voice rising slightly, enough for more passengers to hear. "But it's not. This is about following rules. You can't just sit wherever you want because you feel entitled to." Naomi looked up, her voice gentle but deliberate. "And you think this is about enforcing rules. But it's not. It's about how you treat people, who you think deserves kindness and who you think doesn't." That quiet rebuke hit harder than any insult. Lauren's face darkened. Her hand clenched slightly around the edge of the service cart she had pulled over earlier, the tray now holding just a few remaining glasses of water. She looked around and realized the cabin was no longer silently on her side. The man in the navy blue suit across the aisle had crossed his arms and stared openly at her now. Mrs. Raymond had stopped knitting. Even the nosy socialite who once smirked at Naomi's supposed audacity now shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Trying to reclaim her ground, Lauren forced a laugh and reached for the water tray, approaching Mr. and Mrs. Raymond as if nothing had happened. Her smile reappeared, but this time it felt forced, like a mask that no longer fit her face. "Would either of you like some more sparkling water before takeoff?" she asked, her voice overcompensating in sweetness. Mrs. Raymond shook her head, her expression unreadable. Mr. Raymond simply said, "We're fine." In a flat tone, Lauren's smile faltered, and she turned abruptly, heading back toward the aisle. Naomi had been watching quietly. She hadn't spoken since her last words. She didn't need to. But the stillness was too much for Lauren to bear. As she moved down the narrow aisle, her eyes flicked toward Naomi's extended leg, which slightly touched the edge of the walkway. There was more than enough space to maneuver around it, but in that moment, whether out of anger, pride, or a desire to punish, Lauren deliberately misstepped. Her shoe collided with Naomi's shin, and the tray in her hand shifted just enough for a glass of water to tumble and spill directly onto Naomi's lap. A sharp gasp escaped from a few passengers. Naomi flinched slightly, her hand instinctively brushing the water from her trousers. Her voice was steady, even though the water had soaked through the fabric. "You walked into me," she said, not accusingly but firmly. Lauren placed the tray back on the cart with a loud clatter. Her tone sharpened instantly, her voice rising. "No, you were blocking the aisle. Watch where you put your legs. Now you've made a mess." Naomi slowly raised her eyes. Her face was unreadable, but her tone held an edge that was unmistakable. "You've crossed the line," she said, her voice low. "All I've asked for is to be treated with the same respect you've given everyone else." Lauren scoffed, stepping closer now, as though proximity could intimidate Naomi into silence. "Respect?" she repeated mockingly. "People like you think you can demand respect without earning it?" That was when the moment shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. Lauren's words echoed with prejudice. The cabin fell into silence again. No more whispers, no more shifting in seats. Even Grace took a step back. Naomi's posture didn't change, but her eyes hardened. "You shouldn't have said that," she replied, her voice calm but with unmistakable strength. "That will be the sentence you remember." Lauren, breathing heavily now, stepped even closer. "Are you threatening me?" she hissed, her eyes wide, her fists clenched. "I don't need to threaten you," Naomi said, her gaze steady. "Your own behavior is doing enough damage." And then it happened. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was quick like a spark, a reaction born from rage and fear and loss of control. Lauren's hand shot up and struck Naomi across the face fast, sharp, and without hesitation. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps exploded from every corner of the aircraft. The businessman across the aisle stood halfway, his mouth open in disbelief. Grace let out a strangled gasp and dropped the passenger manifest. Mr. Raymond stood fully now, his newspaper falling to the floor, Mrs. Raymond covered. Her mouth and the nosy socialite let out a shocked, "Oh my God." Naomi didn't flinch. Her face turned slightly from the force of the slap, her braids slipping over her shoulder. A red mark bloomed across her cheek, but she didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She didn't stand. Instead, she straightened herself slowly, like a queen who had just been disrespected in front of her court. Her hands returned to her lap, her posture perfect. Her eyes met Lauren's again, still calm, but now steely, unwavering, and filled with something deeper than anger. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Naomi said quietly. Lauren's hand trembled slightly, but her voice tried to remain firm. "You pushed me, you caused a scene, you were asking for it." "No," Naomi replied, still not raising her voice. "You were looking for someone to control, someone to shame, someone to silence. And you chose the wrong person." It was then that Grace, with her hands still shaking, took a step forward. "Lauren, what did you just do?" she whispered, horror etched across her face. Lauren turned toward her defensively. "She provoked me." "No," the businessman sighed, his voice firm. "I've been watching this since the beginning," she said, nothing out of line. "You've been escalating this from the moment she stepped on this plane." Lauren turned to the rest of the passengers, searching for support, but all she found were cold stares, disbelief, judgment. The power she thought she held had evaporated. Naomi reached for her phone again. She didn't look at it, just touched the screen once. A message had already been sent. Everything had already been set in motion. She didn't need to yell or fight. She just needed to wait. Moments later, a voice buzzed through the intercom system from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been instructed to prepare for an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and buckle up." Whispers erupted. The businessman turned to Naomi again. "Did you?" Naomi offered a faint smile. "It's being handled." Lauren's face went pale. I didn't know," she stammered, taking a step back. "That's the problem," Naomi said, her voice as cool as ever. "You never tried to know, you just assumed." The plane began its descent. Grace rushed to ensure passengers were buckled in, but she kept glancing back at Naomi, her face full of regret and awe. Lauren stood frozen near the service cart, her body tense, her mind racing. She slapped a woman she thought was nobody, but she had no idea that soon she would find out. The unmasking the plane's descent was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the cabin felt as though it had cracked open. An electric silence swept across the leather seats and gold-trimmed fixtures as if the air itself held its breath. The passengers weren't just quiet, they were stunned, frozen in a kind of moral stillness, still processing what they had just witnessed. The slap, the shift in power, and now the unscheduled landing. Naomi hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't retaliated. She hadn't even flinched. And somehow, her silence was louder than the chaos Lauren had caused. The jet wheels touched down gently, but the moment they did, everyone felt the weight of something much heavier. Accountability. Lauren remained rooted to her place near the galley, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the beverage cart. Her confident mask had cracked completely now, her breathing uneven, her thoughts spiraling. In her mind, she replayed every word, every sneer, every step she took down that aisle with her chin held high and her heart full of prejudice. At the time, she believed she was doing her job, upholding the standards of the elite cabin. But now she could feel it slipping, the power, the image, the illusion of control she had worked so hard to maintain. Something about Naomi's composure unnerved her. No one stayed that calm after being humiliated, unless they had nothing to prove and everything to command. The aircraft door had not yet opened, but from the tinted windows, passengers could see a black SUV waiting just outside on the tarmac. It didn't look like security, it didn't look like the police. It looked corporate. Two men in sleek charcoal suits stepped out, their movements purposeful, their expressions unreadable. One opened the rear door of the SUV, while the other adjusted a sleek leather folder under his arm and began walking toward the aircraft stairs. Inside, the murmur began to swell again. The passengers were no longer passive. They leaned toward each other, whispering theories, sharing bits of what they'd seen or heard. The man in the navy suit, seated near Naomi, leaned across the aisle and whispered, "I think we're about to find out who she really is." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't even turn to him. She simply sat there, still and dignified, a figure of self-control. The red mark from the slap had faded slightly, but her silence had grown stronger by the second. A soft chime signaled that the door was being opened. The cabin crew fell silent. The younger flight attendant, Grace, stood near the front, her heart pounding. She had felt trapped in the conflict, torn between doing what was right and following Lauren's orders. Now, as the suited men stepped aboard, Grace knew the moment of truth had come, not just for Lauren, but for everyone who had watched and said nothing. The lead assistant, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a discreet earpiece, walked briskly through the cabin. His eyes scanned the passengers briefly before resting on Naomi. He offered a respectful nod. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice calm and professional, "everything is ready for you." At that moment, the cabin gasped. "Miss Williams?" Naomi stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer as if nothing had happened. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze steady. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as she finally spoke, not in anger, not in defiance, but with the unmistakable tone of someone who owned everything around her. "Thank you," she said softly to the assistant, then turned to face the rest of the cabin. "I'm Naomi Williams," she said clearly. "I own this plane, I own this airline. And until this moment I had hoped I could fly like anyone else, with dignity, privacy, and peace." It was as if a bomb had gone off, not with sound, but with truth. Shock rippled through the passengers like a wave. The socialite gasped audibly. Her heavily glossed lips parted in disbelief. Mr. Raymond exhaled sharply and sat back down with wide eyes, while Mrs. Raymond clutched her knitting needles as if they might fall. Even the businessman beside Naomi seemed to sit straighter, as though he had suspected but couldn't quite believe it until now. Lauren, meanwhile, looked like she had been slapped herself. Her face lost all color, her mouth opened, but no words came. Her arms, once crossed confidently, now hung useless at her sides. "You," she stuttered, barely able to breathe. "You're what?" Naomi turned to her, then not with malice, but with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. "I gave you every chance to correct your assumptions," she said. "Every opportunity to treat me like a person instead of a problem. But you chose ego over empathy. And now we're here." Lauren staggered back a step, her voice caught in her throat. I didn't know." You didn't?" "Ask," Naomi interrupted, her tone still even but with a new sharpness. "Because to you I didn't look like someone who belonged here." The suited assistants moved quietly, respectfully behind Naomi, one of them whispering updates into his earpiece while the other handed Naomi a sleek folder. She opened it slowly and flipped through a few pages. Then, with precision, she pulled out a printed document and held it up, not for Lauren, but for the pilot, who had now stepped out of the cockpit. His expression tight. "This is a formal misconduct complaint," Naomi said, handing it to the captain. "Effective immediately, I expect action to be taken. I also want full internal reports from this crew, statements from the passengers, and the aircraft security recordings preserved." The captain took the document with both hands and nodded respectfully. "Understood, Miss Williams. We'll begin immediately." Lauren shook her head slightly, her face full of panic now. "Please, Miss Williams," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean—" "I just thought—" "That's the danger," Naomi said coldly. "You thought, you assumed, and you acted without facts, without kindness, without a second thought." The silence that followed was total. The air was heavy with realization, with regret, and with something else, admiration. Naomi hadn't shouted. She hadn't broken down. She had let truth and integrity do the work for her. And now that the mask was off, the passengers saw her for who she truly was, not just the owner of the aircraft, but a woman of extraordinary restraint and power. The younger flight attendant, Grace, took a shaky step forward. Her voice was small. but steady. "Miss Williams," she said, I knew something wasn't right. I wanted to speak up, but I was afraid. "I'm so sorry." Naomi looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're young," she said, "but today you've seen what silence can cost. Next time, let your fear take a back seat to your conscience." Grace nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. Naomi turned back to the cabin. "To all of you," she said, addressing the passengers, "I apologize for the disruption. But I do not apologize for standing up. Because if I didn't today, what message would that send about tomorrow?" One by one, the passengers began to applaud. It wasn't loud at first, it wasn't for show, it was genuine. A quiet wave of respect rolled through the cabin. The businessman stood up fully and clapped. Mrs. Raymond followed. Mr. Raymond offered a firm nod of approval. Even the nosy socialite, still wide-eyed, joined in, clapping slowly as if trying to wash away her earlier assumptions with sound. Lauren, meanwhile, looked around the cabin, realizing that the court of public opinion had already passed judgment. She wasn't just a flight attendant who made a mistake. She had become a symbol of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked, and the woman she tried to silence had just become something more than a CEO. She had become a lesson. The applause in the cabin didn't last long, but the echo of it remained in every breath, every glance, every pulse of energy that hummed through the space. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded with weight, with awareness, with the collective understanding that something important had just happened. Naomi didn't ask for that applause. She didn't bask in it or let it change her posture. She merely stood with quiet grace, letting the moment settle. She was not performing. She was standing firm, present, and unshaken. And Lauren, the flight attendant who had carried herself like royalty just moments before, now looked like a castle made of cards trembling in the wind. Lauren backed away a step, her lips parted, her face pale, but no words came. The woman who once commanded the aisle with sharp heels and sharper stares now seemed like a shadow reduced, exposed and trembling in the presence of someone she never imagined could hold such power. The suit she wore no longer gave her authority. Her badge, once a symbol of her pride, now felt like a lie. The passengers had seen everything, the slap, the humiliation, the arrogance. And now, the truth. There was no place left to hide. Number excuse she could give that wouldn't crumble the moment it left her lips. Naomi turned away from her and spoke directly to the pilot who stood a few feet away, still holding the formal misconduct document she had handed him earlier. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but unignorable, "I trust your leadership more than I trust what happened on this flight. But I need you to make something clear to your team, to this company, and to the public, if necessary no employee, no matter how long they've worked here or how sharply they wear their uniform, is above accountability." The captain nodded respectfully, understanding the gravity of the moment. "Yes, Miss Williams, I understand. I assure you this will be addressed immediately." Before anything else could be said, another sound broke the stillness, a heavy knock on the plane's front entrance, followed by the unlocking of the hatch. A moment later, 2 uniformed police officers stepped on board. Their navy uniforms were crisp, their badges glinting in the cabin lights. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a calm tone, looked around and asked plainly, "Miss Naomi Williams?" Naomi gave a small nod. "That's me. We received your report," the officer continued. "You filed an emergency alert from the aircraft. Are you pressing charges for the assault?" Lauren's breath hitched. The word assault had never felt so real, so final. She took a step forward, desperation washing over her features like a tidal wave. "Wait, no, this isn't what you think," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It was a misunderstanding." "I didn't mean to." Naomi raised one hand, not in aggression, not in authority, but simply to stop the noise. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she said. "This was disrespect. This was prejudice. This was a grown woman in a position of authority who used her power to shame, belittle, and eventually strike a paying passenger. And I'm not filing this as a business owner. I'm filing this as a human being," the officer nodded once. "Ma'am, would you like to make a formal statement now or after we've taken the subject into custody?" I'll submit the full statement shortly, Naomi said. For now, I just want to ensure that she's removed from this aircraft, and that the passengers here understand something important. There are consequences for disrespect. Real ones, Lauren gasped and took another step back. Please, Miss Williams, I didn't know who you were. I thought you were in the wrong seat, that's all. Naomi turned to her, her eyes cool and full of steel. No, you decided I was in the wrong seat. You didn't ask? You didn't check? You didn't give me the benefit of human decency. And when I stood my ground, you retaliated. Physically, in front of witnesses? You didn't act out of confusion, you acted out of entitlement? The passengers watched, spellbound. Even those who had initially ignored the situation now sat forward, captivated by the reckoning unfolding before them. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned closer to Naomi's side and whispered, "She deserves this. Every bit of it." The police officers stepped forward. "Lauren Mitchell," the lead officer said, "you're under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." "No, please," Lauren cried, her voice trembling. "This is my career. I've been in this job for 13 years. I can't lose everything over one mistake." But her words were swallowed by the sound of the officer's voice continuing to read her rights. One officer gently pulled her arms behind her back, securing her wrists in cold silver cuffs. Lauren winced, humiliated. She looked around the cabin, searching for anyone to defend her, but no one stood. No one spoke. She had been the loudest voice on the plane just minutes ago. Now her silence was deafening. Grace, the younger flight attendant, looked away, her lips trembling. Naomi noticed. "Grace," Naomi called gently, her tone softer now, "look at me." The young woman lifted her eyes, guilt shining in them. "You were caught in the middle," Naomi said. "But next time you feel something's wrong, say something. Even if it costs you. Because silence doesn't protect you, it only protects the injustice." Grace nodded slowly, a tear escaping down her cheek. The police officers led Lauren down the aisle. The passengers turned to watch her pass. No one clapped. No one shouted. There was no need. Her walk of shame said everything. As she reached the front of the plane, she turned one last time to Naomi. Her lips trembled. "Please." Naomi didn't answer. She simply held her gaze, not with cruelty, but with a strength that said, "This is justice, not vengeance." As Lauren was escorted off the aircraft, the door closed behind her with a heavy thud. It wasn't just the sound of a plane hatch shutting. It was the sound of a chapter ending. The captain cleared his throat. "We'll resume our flight in a few minutes," he said through the cabin microphone. "Please remain seated as the crew rechecks final departure procedures." Naomi turned back to her seat and sat down, her blazer still sharp, her hands still calm. The businessman next to her leaned in again. "If I may ask," he said cautiously, "why didn't you say something earlier? When she was yelling at you?" Naomi looked out the window for a long second, the reflection of the clouds in her eyes. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes people have to show you who they really are, and sometimes silence lets them speak loudest." He nodded, visibly moved. "You're remarkable." Naomi offered a faint smile. "No, I'm just done shrinking to make others comfortable." The rest of the flight was quiet, respectful, peaceful. Naomi didn't have to ask for water. Grace brought it without hesitation, along with a fresh blanket and a quiet apology. The atmosphere had changed. Not because a billionaire had spoken, but because a woman had finally been heard. The interview that shook the nation, the news spread faster than anyone could have expected. Before the plane had even reached its final destination, footage recorded by multiple passengers had already gone viral across every major platform. The slap, the confrontation, the reveal. Every moment had been captured. Every second was dissected by thousands, then millions of viewers around the world. And while some headlines shouted about billionaire humiliated by flight attendant, most took a different angle entirely. They didn't focus on Naomi's wealth. They focused on her silence, her grace, her refusal to stoop down. She had been disrespected, humiliated, assaulted, and she hadn't raised her voice. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she shook an entire industry. Naomi didn't chase the attention. She didn't post a response video, didn't tweet, didn't issue any public statement in those first 48 hours. She remained silent, letting the world come to its own conclusions. And they did. Editorials flooded in from every corner, some praising her as a new icon of quiet power, others asking why this kind of injustice was still so normal in luxury spaces. Celebrities reposted the footage with messages of solidarity. Influencers told their followers to be more like Naomi, but Naomi herself? She stayed quiet. Until the requests from news networks became too loud to ignore. It wasn't about fame for her. She had enough of that in business circles. It wasn't about going viral either. She knew how quickly attention turned into noise. But it was the younger generation that moved her, students, workers, young professionals from around the world who flooded her inbox with letters and messages saying, "Thank you for showing us how to stand tall without yelling. You gave me hope that dignity still matters. You spoke without shouting, and the world listened." That's when she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She didn't owe the media a story. But maybe, just maybe, she owed the world a message. 3 days after the flight, Naomi appeared in a televised interview broadcast globally. The studio was elegant and quiet, bathed in warm, soft lighting that reflected her calm presence. She wore a deep emerald green dress, simple yet stunning, and sat with the same graceful posture she had held on the plane. Across from her sat the host, a seasoned journalist known for getting straight to the heart of the matter. The studio audience was small, intimate, carefully selected. Everyone was on edge, waiting to hear from the woman who had managed to turn one of the ugliest moments of discrimination into a symbol of transformation. "Miss Williams," the interviewer began gently, "you've been silent until now. What made you decide to speak today?" Naomi looked up, her eyes unwavering. "Because I realized this wasn't just about me," she said. "It wasn't just about one flight, one insult, one slap. It was about the people watching who have experienced the same thing in schools, in boardrooms, in hotels, in restaurants. People who are told in subtle and loud ways, 'You don't belong here,' and I wanted to say, once and for all, that they do, we do." The interviewer leaned forward. "You could have responded with anger. You could have demanded recognition the moment you stepped on that plane. Why didn't you?" Naomi didn't pause. "Because I wanted people to see the full picture. To see what happens when you don't fit someone else's idea of belonging. I wanted people to watch the story play out without knowing who I was, so they could see the truth of it. If I had announced my title or wealth from the start, people would have said, 'Well, of course she got justice. She's rich.' But I wanted to prove a point, that dignity isn't something you earn by status. It's something everyone deserves." The interviewer nodded slowly, visibly moved. "You've been called a hero, a role model. Some are calling this Naomi's flight like it's a movement. What do you want people to take from this moment?" Naomi turned to the camera now, her voice clear, steady, and deeply intentional. "I want people to understand that respect is not a privilege. It's a human right. It should not depend on what you wear, where you sit, what language you speak, or the color of your skin. The moment we allow disrespect to be normalized even in small ways, we open the door to something bigger and uglier. I didn't speak up that day to prove my worth. I spoke up because I knew there were thousands who couldn't, and because silence can either protect injustice or it can expose it." The audience sat in stunned stillness. A few nodded slowly. Others wiped away silent tears. The interviewer then asked, "And what about Lauren, the flight attendant who slapped you? Do you think she deserves forgiveness?" Naomi's expression shifted, still calm, but laced with something heavier now. "Forgiveness is personal," she said softly. "It's something I give to protect my peace, not erase the consequences. She doesn't need my forgiveness. She needs reflection. She needs to ask herself why she treated someone with contempt based on a snap judgment. If she does that work truly, deeply, without making excuses, then perhaps one day she'll grow from this. But forgiveness doesn't mean I forget what happened. It just means I won't let it define me. The applause in the studio was not loud, it was soft, respectful, reverent. Naomi's words didn't demand claps, they invited understanding. Her story had become something greater than a viral moment. It had become a mirror for society. Following the interview, news outlets quoted her message across the globe. Students carried her words into classroom debates. Corporations hosted panels on racial bias and dignity in the workplace. Airline unions quietly reviewed their policies. Luxury brands discussed the danger of gatekeeping respect based on appearance. Even silent staff members from the original flight reached out privately, saying they had learned a lesson they'd carry for the rest of their lives. Naomi, however, didn't bask in it. She returned to work, holding meetings, reviewing projects, mentoring young professionals through her foundation. But there was one change. A policy quietly launched and implemented within her airline in which every crew member would receive extensive training not just in customer service, but in unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and power dynamics. Not because of public pressure, but because Naomi believed leadership wasn't about reacting when the world was watching. It was about doing the right thing when no one was. Her team called it the Respect Initiative. Its motto was simple: luxury begins with dignity. And across airports and flight paths, things began to shift. Naomi's name became more than a headline. It became a standard. Legacy in the sky 3 weeks later. The sky over San Francisco was streaked with lavender clouds as the sun prepared to dip behind the horizon. On the runway of a private terminal, another jet stood gleaming beneath the golden light. Its design was familiar, sleek, modern, and unmistakably exclusive, but the energy surrounding it felt different. There was no tension in the air, no tight-lipped smiles, no unspoken rules about who belonged. Only efficiency, respect, and quiet anticipation. Inside the aircraft, the cabin was warm and welcoming. The gold accents still glowed the leather. Seats still whispered luxury, but there was something else, a presence of sincerity that hadn't existed before. Each crew member moved with grace, not just rehearsed politeness, but genuine care. Every glance, every gesture, every smile was real. The culture had changed. And though few would say it out loud, everyone knew why Naomi Williams stepped aboard, not as a symbol, not as a billionaire in disguise, but simply as herself a leader who had weathered injustice without hardening, a woman who had turned humiliation into a message for the world. She wore a cream pantsuit today, effortlessly elegant, with soft gold earrings that caught the cabin light just enough to remind people that her power didn't come from shine, it came from who she chose to be. Even when no one believed in her as she walked down the aisle, heads turned, but not in judgment or confusion. This time it was admiration. Some passengers recognized her instantly and gave her quiet nods of respect. Others, unfamiliar with the incident, sensed something about her aura and moved politely to give her space. The lead flight attendant, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and calm energy, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Miss Williams," he said, bowing his head slightly, "welcome back. We're honored to have you with us." Naomi returned the smile, subtle and grateful. "Thank you. It's good to be here." The younger flight attendant beside him knew, nervous, and likely on his first major assignment, clutched his service list too tightly but managed to stammer, "Can I get you anything before takeoff? Water? Juice? A warm towel?" Naomi's eyes softened. She could see herself in him, not literally, but spiritually, someone learning how to navigate a world that didn't always give you room to be both kind and firm. "Just water, thank you," she said, "and relax." "You're doing fine," he nodded quickly, eyes wide with both relief and awe. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." She moved to her seat first row, window side. She didn't need a corner office in the sky to feel important. She had built her empire on substance, not spectacle. As she settled in, she looked out at the runway stretching into the soft colors of twilight. Something about the view reminded her of that day. The slap, the whispers, the moment she chose not to fight with fists, but with grace. She remembered the sting on her cheek, not just from Lauren's hand, but from every moment in her life when she had been told, in subtle ways, "You're too much. You're not enough. You don't fit." That flight wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but it had been the last time she let it slide in silence. The intercom chimed. The captain welcomed everyone aboard and gave a brief safety update. Naomi barely listened, her mind drifting. Her assistant had updated her earlier. The Respect initiative had expanded to 5 other airlines, all adopting Naomi's Dignity First protocol. Grace, the young flight attendant who had stood frozen that day, had been promoted to training lead for new hires. And Lauren? She had issued a public apology after being released from custody. Not a PR statement, but a handwritten letter Naomi received by mail. It didn't ask for forgiveness, it acknowledged every mistake. And Naomi hadn't responded, not out of cruelty, but because some apologies are received in silence, not returned. Just then, Naomi's phone buzzed quietly. A notification. Her media team had posted her latest video, a 5-minute message titled "Belonging Shouldn't Be Earned." In it, she spoke directly into the camera. No music, no fancy lighting. Just her voice saying, "No seat, no title, no uniform makes you more worthy of kindness than the person next to you." In less than 10 minutes, the video had gained over 3 million views. Comments flooded in from women, men, children, employees, CEOs, people from every walk of life. Naomi read only a few lines before her eyes welled. "I showed this video to my daughter. She finally believes her skin isn't something she has to apologize for. Because of you, I stood up to my manager when he disrespected a coworker. You didn't just sit in that seat, Miss Williams. You built it for the rest of us." She blinked the tears away and smiled softly, placing the phone face down. Moments later, a familiar face approached from the other side of the aisle. Mr. Raymond, the elderly gentleman who had been a silent witness to the confrontation weeks ago, now stood near her seat, holding a paperback novel in one hand and a quiet grin in the other. "Miss Williams," he said, gently tapping the seat back. "I never got to say it properly, but thank you." Naomi looked up and gave a respectful nod. "For what?" "For showing all of us that calm doesn't mean weak," he replied. "You reminded me what real leadership looks like. I spent 40 years managing people, and I think you taught me more in one flight than I learned in 4 decades. Naomi chuckled lightly. "It wasn't just me. That moment taught us all." He offered his hand. She shook it firmly, and then he returned to his seat, flipping open his book doc as the engines roared softly and the plane began its steady ascent into the sky. Naomi leaned back into her seat and closed her eyes. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the window beside her, layered over the clouds drifting past. She wasn't thinking about the fame, or the headlines, or the applause. She was thinking about the quiet transformation she had become part of, not by shouting louder, but by standing stronger. When the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Naomi looked out once more at the endless expanse of sky. The clouds stretched wide and weightless, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that same lightness in her chest. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because she knew she had helped it take one honest step forward. She picked up her notebook from the side pocket and began to write. Not business notes, not legal plans, but a letter. A note to her younger self, the girl who once hesitated to raise her hand in classrooms, who lowered her voice in meetings, who doubted her place in every room where others walked in freely. "Dear Naomi," she wrote, "you belonged all along.